cops have read it. What's the creepiest thing you found during a house search? Possibly too late to the party, but here it goes. I was a fresh officer with dreams being a hero. I get dispatched to a call of a family fight. Not wife husband, but brother sister. The female was reporting the male had attacked her. I arrived and located a female and male. The male I knew from prior contacts. I detained him in handcuffs and quickly smelled the strong odor of pepper spray. I found out that after the male knocked off the female's weave she pepper sprayed him. I knew there were different types of pepper spray, like gel. I'm walking around the house taking photos for my investigation and accessing the property damage. I noticed that in his room the odor from the pepper spray was extremely strong and made my eyes instantly water with a decent amount of stinging sensation. The fumes made it incredibly hard to breathe and left me without the ability to breathe at points, requiring that I leave the room to get fresh air. I find a brownish gel substance all over the walls in the shape of handprints. I photograph it and determine that it was the pepper gel that male suspect was wiping off of his face onto the wall. I found it odd that it was all over the walls and covered the room, although this chick dusted him with the entire can of pepper gel. After some investigation I took the male to jail. I responded to the same house several days after for an unrelated medical issue. There were more family members at the house and the male was still in custody. I was having a conversation with the family as the hero firefighters were saving the day. I inquired if they had fully cleaned up the pepper spray from the male's room. They gave me a strange look and told me there was none in there. I told them about the gel that was on the wall. I then sat there in horror as they explained to me this man had been, for years, coming on his walls and playing with it. And the gel was in fact old cum and the fumes were the pungent smell of this man's cum room. My faking god. Edit. I keep a running digital journal of shit I've seen on the job and located this entry. Here is a photo from the room. imgur.com/rb6.png edit 2. I'd like to thank the random stranger for gold and all of you for the upvotes. It's nice to know that Reddit really only likes me because I was in another man's cum room of fun. At my grandparents on vacation in Iowa. They live in the middle of nowhere, couple elderly neighbors, and cornfields for miles. It was like 2 AM, and I was gonna go have a smoke before bed. Their back porch has a big sliding door. Well, I walk into the room with the sliding door, and there's a guy in creepy mask like this imgur.com/ufm.png and his eyes are jet black. He's quietly wiggling the door, trying to open it. The lock is weird and lets the door have like an inch of free play. I got so scared I felt my butthole clench up and I dropped my cig. Right then the guy freezes and looks right at me. He pauses, then starts frantically shaking the door trying to open it. Like this dude is trying to rip the door off the faking house. I run over to my grandpa's gun cabinet and grab something. IDK what was some old gun, and by the time I whipped around to point it at him, he was gone. I ran and woke up my grandparents. We all walked around the house with loaded guns for a minute, but the guy was gone. A couple weeks later some bald guy walked out of the cornfield wearing a dress. He stood by the highway for half an hour, then got picked up by some sketchy car. I won't even go in cornfields in broad daylight anymore. My aunt is a police dispatcher. Normally she takes calls from the public and has an officer nearby respond. But one day she was asked to work the station's radio because the normal guy was sick. That meant she was acting as the central hub of the police radio network, taking calls from officers in the field and issuing backup to them, that kind of thing. She wound up having to listen to 4 cops talking back and forth in a panic as 2 squad cars arrived to check on a reported murder. The person who called was certain that there were multiple killers present. The victim's meat had been cut into 1-inch cubes, as if their killer was going to fry them up or make kebabs. The whole crops had been disassembled like that. Bones cut into neat-inch segments, organs removed, separated, organized. She remembers one of the officers panicked and screamed something along the lines of "This is OCD movie monster bullshit." I can't remember the exact quote sadly, and I doubt my aunt remembers it herself. She thought they were playing a joke on her until they called for a hazmat crew to get the body. My uncle is a cop and likes to tell the story of the time he shown up to arrest a 15-year-old who skipped school to throw rocks through some cars and steal things in them. He gets there and knows the kid. They've gotten him a few times from the school with drugs, one time for having a knife. They knock on the door and his 18-year-old brother and 17-year-old sister open it. Cops say what they want and they tell them to fuck off. Cops show they have the warrant for the kid's arrest and that they have to open the door. Get told another time and now the other cop car pulls up and asks what's going on. Uncle said they might have to force their way in and break the chain. 18-year sheethead says he's got a gun. About 3 seconds later the door is broken. 18-year-old sheethead is tased. 17-year is screaming for the brother. Hoss wanted to book it. He jumps out the window and gets away. For now, brother is thrown in cop car. 17-year slaps the one officer, gets the same free ride and bracelets. They call the property manager and get permission to enter the house completely to investigate. The second floor reeks. Worst smell they've ever smelled. They get upstairs and it just gets worse and worse. They open the door and find a long rotten body surrounded by needles and other drug sheet. They leave and call it in. Uncle said later it came out that their grandmother died of an overdose. The mother was in jail for stabbing a Raps guy, and the kids never reported the grandmother was dead, so they could keep cashing her social security checks. She was dead for about a year. Other than that, his best creepy stories were a guy who tortured and killed animals by feeding them to other animals, not mouse to snake, think more cat to dog, or weight a large rabbit to a starved snapping turtle. He also mailed several live rodents and cats to a board in the basement where he'd photograph them, and the other is a drug dealer who killed a guy and tried to put him through a meat grinder and feed his pit bull. I volunteer with local PD and I go on ride along often. My creepy thing isn't scary so much as freaky, so we get a call about some squatters in a house that's going to be demolished soon to make room for a freeway. No big deal. Kick them out, go on with our business. It's sunset, just starting to get dark. Our car and the other officer arrive at this place and it's all fenced off and looks abandoned. And by abandoned, I mean it looks scary as hell. It was like an old schoolhouse, metal swing set, a friendly scarecrow next to a fence. Some crosses here and there, but it was in a residential neighborhood. On the blocked-in windows, people wrote in Sharpie all kinds of spooky stuff. This place belongs to us, and just all around weird shit, like even creepier than that. So there was a main house, a garage type thing, and then a cellar, a faking door leading underground with creaky as wooden steps. And so if you walk down those, it's concrete and there are windows, but it's a basement. The windows just show dirt. There are beds and stuff, but it looks like it's been abandoned for a long time. It was so scary it's ridiculous. If this comment gains any traction, I'll drive over and take pictures of it. I know it's still up edit. I'll go snap some pictures today after class. They should be up around 2 PM California time. Update. I went and checked it out. I guess they demolished it because it was a haven for squatters/homeless people and some people still live in the surrounding houses. I don't know when they demolished it because I was there with my girlfriend maybe 2 to 3 months ago and I figured it would still be up. Sorry guys. I did, however, get some pictures of the demolished land / a screenshot from Google Maps that gives me a little proof. This was my first chance to deliver as op and I disappointed you all. Imgur link, imgur.com/av6a. Super late to this, but I'll post anyway. We went to an apartment which was a local drug den. A female we knew called and said the male renter had been assaulted and she had run. We got there and the door was bolted shut. I kicked the door over and over again and it wouldn't open. What I found out later is the dope team had done a search warrant on the apartment a couple weeks earlier and afterward the tenants had reinforced the door jamb with a metal plate. It took me a total of 22 times kicking the door before I broke the deadbolt in half, which flew across the room and hit the wall. We made entry, guns drawn, and started clearing the apartment. This place was the kind of spooky I have only seen in places where a lot of meth is done. It was dark. There were swastikas, 666, upside down pentagrams, etc. painted on the wall, pictures of faces hung on the wall with the eyes out, and baby dolls with their eyes scratched out into X's. As we cleared the first room we started seeing the blood. First on the bed, then a trail on the floor leading into the back room. The layout was weird. One main room, then a back room which was more of a hallway and a bathroom at the end of that hall. We followed the trail of blood down the hall to the bathroom door. In front of the door was a renter's dog which was shaking uncontrollably and bissing all over the floor, scared out of its mind. As we got closer, the dog got really aggressive because it was scared. I made my way around the dog and entered the bathroom, where I found the renter hunched over in the shower, bleeding from his face, holding his cheeks with his hands. He was frantically trying to talk, pleading with us not to hurt his dog. Blood was dripping from his mouth and I couldn't understand him. Then I saw the extent of what had happened to him. His jaw had been dislocated on both sides when he was beat by two men with a hammer, and it was just hanging there. As he was trying to plead with us, he could only attempt to talk by flicking his blood-covered tongue in the pattern of the words, because his jaw didn't work at all. Edit. Grammar. Taking this law class, my professor brings in a cop to talk about points of law. At one point the cop shows the class a picture of a man who committed suicide by gun. "Can you see what color his eyes are?" he asked. Of course noon can. And after sign stares, the cop says blue, one blue this way, the other blue that way. The whole class groans, and I raised my hand. Obviously you have thicker skin about this sorry of thing than we do. Have you ever seen anything that got to you? The cop got serious looking and then told us this story. A local family, two brothers, both young. Every Saturday morning the older brother would get up early and make toast, and both he and his younger brother would sit in front of the TV, munch some toast and watch Saturday morning cartoons. This one Saturday the older brother didn't want to get up and make toast, so the younger brother decided to try it himself. He apparently went into the kitchen, put the bread in, and pulled the switch down. He didn't notice how close the toaster was to the kitchen window curtains. To make a long story short, the house caught fire and the parents barely made it out alive with the oldest son. By the time the police officer arrived, the younger boy was dead, burned to death in the living room. The officer said he must have set the toaster and went into the living room to watch TV and wait for his older brother to wake up and join him. The officer said the window nearby had collapsed from the heat and melted around the little boy. The cop said he had two boys about their age at that time. Said he had to excuse himself from the scene, went to his squad car, and couldn't stop crying and shaking. As the cop told the story in class, he started crying again. Crazy sad cop story, and I made a cop cry. This one wasn't mine, but from an EMT friend. It's also maybe not so much creepy as nasty, but it makes my hair stand on end whenever I think on it. In one of the apartments in a nearby city, the app manager went in to investigate a really bad smell in one of the lower units. Apparently people all around it were complaining. Once he saw what was up, he called the ambulance. So first responders show up, which includes said EMT friend, and there's this lady sitting on the couch. There's also something squirmy going on down below in her underpants area. So they check her out, and in the process remove said undergarments. Out falls a swarm of maggots. Yes, her lady bits were covered in them. Apparently, said individual had a fairly strong substance abuse problem. Some of the needles she poked into her nethers, which caused an infection. This led to rotting flesh which attracted flies, which in turn led to maggots. The worst part, she was not dead, just so drugged up that she basically never noticed that she was literally rotting and falling apart from the waist down. I spent my first year as a constable in an inner city suburb of Queensland. Now, of the population of this area, something like 40% was reserved for government commissioned housing for rehabilitated criminals and persons released from mental health assessment centers. So here was a share of creepy shit, but to be fair, for the most part, the people we dealt with were more like cartoon characters than super shady creeps, but they had their moments. One guy that we had met before just decided one afternoon to start destroying shit in the commission set of units he lived at. He was going faking off, kicking through latticing, throwing pot plants off of buildings at passers-bys, stealing and collecting people's shoes, smashing car windows. After about 15 minutes of mayhem, he must have ran out of steam and gone back to his unit. That's where we found him, and he decided to bung on a turn. He just would not stop screaming and bashing his head and face into any surface or object he could find. Eventually we got a van with a pod and secured him. Then we went back into the house to figure out what the fuck had happened. The house is a clusterfuck. Somehow he had fit to Cole's trolleys inside and was using them as furniture. The whole place smelt of rotting food and shit. On the coffee table, if you can call it that, are a series of scrawled notes of just expletives. Again, not massive mental function with this guy. And a wooden box. Inside the wooden box was about 100 small clip seal bags. Over half the bags had a brown granular organic material in them. The others had clear crystal-like stuff in them. The brown bags were somewhat organized from smallest to largest staples. Now with the type of people we had in the area, we had all sorts of wonderful ways these people got high. We were used to seeing weird shit that people would ingest. So we don't recognize these bags, but we've got a pretty good idea it's a narcotic of some kind. So of course, we examine these bags and the contents. There is enough there to test if need be, so I get one of these bags and empty the contents to see it better. So these samples of brown material, they've got flecks of color and little tendril-like hairs, not unusual for a plant derivative to have. But I've never seen it before, so I'm looking at it as I hold talking to my partner that it might be really coarse hash derivative or a byproduct of production of something else. Cat maybe. Might explain why this guy went nuts. A dog unit officer who assisted with the arrest comes in. He sees the scene, looks at the coffee table, looks at the bags, looks at me holding the contents of one in the palm of my hand, and straight away says, "That guy's got golden staph, he's been collecting scabs." This guy had been picking at a golden staph infection on his leg, collecting the scabs, organizing them into smallest to largest, and then eating them. The small yellow crystals, snot and crust from his nose. Same end goal. TLDR, I responded to a disturbance call and fondled the real-life Goldmember's personal stash by mistake. Sheet was faked. I bought shares in personal hand sanitizer after that. Edit. Asked my brother, can give some more info. Not a cop, but my brother is an EMT that told me these two stories. Cops got called because some children were wandering around in the yard of a house in the evening. Neighbors had never seen those children and there were no parents or other people. No lights on in the house or any signs of somebody being home. The children weren't wearing any clothes. They approach the kids. The children are 6 to 10 years old, but talk in an indistinguishable language or basically gibberish. Cops call for backup and ambulance because this gets freaky. They take care of the kids outside. Nobody knows what the kids are saying. They're very pale, like they've never been out in the sun. Cops enter the house. No electricity. It's dark, so they ask their flashlights. House seems to be used yet is cluttered and not well taken care of. They look around and find a crib with something laying in it. No sound. No movement sheet. One of the cops goes outside. Can't handle it. Other officers walk over. Relief. It's just a doll. Real bad case of neglect. Parents apparently left for the day and forgot to lock up the kids. Another story. Cops got called to a house. They enter and look around. They walk around the house and check the cellar. They find rooms with doors similar to prison cells. Kids inside. They can talk but can't see because there was no light in their cells. Their eyes didn't develop properly. Because my brother is an EMT, he doesn't know the end of the story, but this freaked everybody out. Not a cop, but a former officer of the law told me this years ago. I will let you decide if he's full of shit or not. The officer had responded to a parent's call to arrest their son, whom they were convinced had relapsed on meth. What had tipped them off was when the son had started blasting both thrash metal and born on maximum volume from his bedroom and locked himself in. Communication with the kid was impossible with the noise. However, the officer's partner had been able to glance into the kid's window and could see that he was sitting motionless in front of his computer. He was shirtless, but otherwise everything seemed rather normal. With permission from the parents, the officers decided to push through the lock. Moans and groans and relentless guitar deafened the ears. The only light illuminating the room was the bluish hue of the computer monitor. The kid's face was a distorted grin, stretching to his lips' furthest limits. He wasn't shirtless, he was in fact naked and drenched in sweat, and in his right hand, cupped like a chalice, were his testicles, which he had ripped off in a flurry of drug-induced self-mutilation. Formerly O with two stories. Got dispatched to a call. Daughter has tried to reach her elderly mom and can't make contact. These usually end badly. Made location at the house and received written authorization from daughter to make forced entry at the front door. Asked the daughter to wait by the squad car and had fire department spread the door frame open. Immediately noticed the smell and began to search the house. Found the mom in the kitchen laying on open door of the oven. Half of her face and hair were burnt off and the oven was still on cooking her. Apparently, we found out from the daughter, the mother used the oven for heat and had a heart attack and fell on the oven door. Best thing I can say, it looked like Harvey Dent from the Nolan Badman film. Second story, got a call from dispatch about a woman screaming from an abandoned apartment saying she was being tortured/killed. My partner, 4 other officers, and I had to search every room and door in what looked like a college dorm. All the doors faced inwards and there was absolutely no way of knowing where the screaming was coming from. Partner found the woman covered in her own blood running out of an apartment. I held apartment door while he ran her down. Scariest call of my life. Turns out she was tripping on PCP and have been cutting herself. There was no way of knowing that until we searched the apartment. I swear that Michael Myers Kruger Chucky was waiting behind every door in that apartment waiting to stab me. Awesome time. Some guys were four-wheeling at a local lake in an old topless Ford Bronco with no windshield. It rolled and threw everyone out but the driver. It was remote and took us a while to get there. When I arrived, everyone that could move was kneeled against the Bronco. When I walked up to it, I could hear screams coming from underneath. It was agonizing, those screams. I shined my flashlight underneath and I could see the guy's face. His head was so deformed from the weight of the vehicle and he was still alive, just screaming. FD was still a few minutes out and we didn't have anything to lift it off him. The kneeling people were apparently trying to lift it off. Then they reverted to digging. It was horrible. Such a helpless feeling for what seemed like eternity. The screaming eventually became low moans that eventually stopped. The guy passed away before we could get him out. This was my first year as a police officer. Later that night, early morning, I had to go tell his wife about his passing. Death notification. It was really hard not to break down crying with her. She wanted to know more details and all I could think of was the screaming. I'm not sure she ever learned the horrible details we encountered that night, but I didn't tell her. Those screams woke me up many nights 4 years after. Eventually they get replaced with new human tragedies. Australian here. Worked remote enough for some good stories. Late at night, called to a drunken dispute where a firearm had been discharged. Attended with 4 or 5 of us, the whole patrol group. Found the gun, which was all good. My partner went to unload it and realized it had no trigger. He went to touch the safety and paused. We both had a closer look and then asked the owners. Apparently the safety was the trigger. Anyway, no one was licensed, so we searched the house for extra ammo or other weapons. No one is really supposed to have guns here unless you have a good reason. Don't know why I did it. It was a dumb idea given the state of the house and the area. Dog poop on the floor and stuff. Nappers everywhere. I opened the fridge, staring face to face with a kangaroo with its paws out looking at me. That was the top shelf. I looked down one shelf and there was the other half of the kangaroo, tail hanging down off the middle shelf. The smell. Oh dear, the smell. The light was on. Not sure the fridge actually worked though. Closed the door pretty fast. Of course the most reasonable thing to do was move to another part of the room and yell at my partner to check the fridge. Not really creepy, just unusual. I was newish at the time. Not a cop but EMS. This happened a few months back. I would volunteer with EMS, a town about 20 minutes away from where I live. Pretty small, so it's pretty slow. We get the first call of the day around 10 AM. I asked the medic what the call was and he says 44. I asked what that was, since I haven't heard of that before. He says the guy shot himself with a 44. I wasn't sure if I should believe him, since he bullshits sometimes. We get to the scene and PD is already there. The 2 officer and some FD volunteers are there waiting by the door. I walk into the house and instantly something doesn't smell right. I look around and notice the guy's a hoarder. I think maybe it's something thrown around that smells. We continue to the bedroom and there's the guy's laying face down, head between his nightstand and his bed. It smelled pretty bad. He had a gash on his head from where he hit his head when he fell, and I'm guessing hit the nightstand. He was 60 years old and pretty unhealthy. The other medics and police said he probably didn't die right away. The guy had been dead for about a week. He was starting to decompose. Had maggots on him, and his skin was wet to the touch. Bubbles of water deposits on the outer layer of skin. They made us check for a pulse, so we hooked him up to our monitor. He had no pulse. I was surprised they made us check for a pulse. Like really? He's dead as can be. But they needed a printout for some reason. The smell was similar to a dead animal smell, but it lingered, and I would occasionally smell it throughout the day. On my way home I passed a dead animal, and since I was on my Jeep with no top I got the smell pretty hard, almost puked. Late to the party, but we got sent to a well-being check for an old lady that lived by herself in a rough section of the city. This was a few years back, but if I remember correctly, she had no family or friends. Some sort of wellness aide called it in. No one had heard from her in a few days. We knock, announce ourselves, nothing. We get a property manager on the phone. He comes by with a key. We open the door and there she is, very dead on the floor, look of fear/pain frozen on her face. One of her feet was detached, and about a meter, metric to avoid bad puns, away from her body, and blood everywhere. I instantly assume she was murdered, and get a shot of adrenaline, but then we take a second, and take in the whole scene. This is how the woman died. She needed to adjust her blinds, so she got a chair from the kitchen, stood up on the chair, lost her balance, fell and landed on her foot which snapped clean off her leg. She then proceeded to crawl around bleeding, until she passed out and died. I've seen much worse, but that one sticks with me, because I can't even imagine the thoughts running through her head as she was dying, all alone and unable to summon help. In keeping with the question, and not venturing into storyland with things that have occurred outside houses. Homeless man died inside a vacant house in July, had been there about 2 weeks before someone found him. Maggots crawling inside his mouth and eyes, extremely bloated. He popped when the FD went to move it. They had on full SCBA gear. It was awful. Lady died inside of her house and wasn't found for a week or so. Her dog had started chewing her left foot off in hunger. Guy died inside of his house and had no family checking on him. He was there about 6 months before we found him. He looked like a mummy actually. All the thoughtful suicides, putting up tarps before blowing your brains out, or the one guy that lived in a studio apt above a popular restaurant. He removed part of his ceiling to get to a crossbeam to hang himself. He cleaned up the mess, vacuumed, did his dishes, made his bed, laid out various piles of cash/property and each had a handwritten note for the recipient, and then turned on some music and hung himself. And my personal favorite, a vacant mansion in town, was owned by a rich family, and it kept getting burglarized. My zone partner, female, and I, male, would occasionally go inside the house and do a walkthrough to make sure no one was inside. We decided to do the whole house one night instead of just the first 2 floors. Went up to the attic and found boxes of Bourne magazines and books, mostly vanilla stuff. But there was one book, don't know what it was called, and we flipped to a random page. A lady was jacking a guy off with the bend of her arm. Like where the elbow is. Turn the page, the guy is literally faking her armpit. Couple pages later, the guy has moved south, but he has skipped over the honey hole on the Hershey Highway, and was now faking the bend in her knee. I looked at my partner, we were very good friends, both married, and said I wonder what that feels like. And she looked at me and smiled, and said why don't you try it, and find out for yourself? That was not an invitation, apparently. TLDR, I found several creepy things on house searches, and the creepiest thing my zone partner found was me. So I heard this one from dad, and it's like 2 stories in one. My dad worked for a restoration company, and they had a contract with the city for first response to certain emergencies. The cops were called to do a welfare check on a woman. The family hadn't heard from her in a week or so. When they got there, they could see her lying on the ground by the front door through the window. They ended up breaking down the back door to get in, and she was long gone. So they called the restoration company to come board up the broken back door. My dad arrived on scene before they removed the body. She was all bloated and nasty. My dad, never having seen a dead body except at a funeral, was a bit disturbed. The chief of the fire department was there and asked him if he was doing okay and if it was his first dead body. My dad was like, yeah. The fire chief didn't seem bothered at all, so my dad asked him what the worst thing he ever saw was. He had 3 stories and this was in my opinion the most disturbing. The scene. Apparently bystanders had seen a guy on his cell phone and he was clearly arguing with someone. He hung up abruptly and threw his phone on the ground in anger and then walked out to the highway. I'm not sure the exact road setup. A 16-wheel semi was driving up and he jumped out in front of it. The driver tried to stop but couldn't. Every single wheel ran over him. When the fire chief got there he said there were body parts and little pieces everywhere. The chief thought there was no way someone could survive that. He walked up the majority of the body and heard noises. Apparently the guy was still breathing. Then after a moment, he stopped. Immediately the chief goes to start in for CPR. As soon as he touched the man's face, his whole head caved in. Like a rotting pumpkin. Oh Christ. So we get a call to do a welfare check. Someone called the station house because they haven't heard from their mom and could we pretty please swing by to check on her. Fine. We get to the apartment building, knock on the door, and when there's inevitably no answer, we grab the super to open the door for us. The first sign that things were going terribly wrong was that the chain was still on the door. The second was the god-awful stench coming from the place that told us there was something dead inside. As before, it's dark in there and none of the lights worked because they had burned out in the time the poor lady was sitting there. We found her on the couch. Positive Q sign. Hang your tongue out of your mouth like you're dead and you get the idea, and smelled of beginning stages of decomposition. So it's the doer, the cops in the living room and the super standing in the doorway of this dark apartment, and we obviously have our flashlights trained on the guest of honor. At this point the dead person raises a hand to her eyes in a very zombie fashion and says, "Nah." Exactly like that. So totally a zombie, right? Having seen enough, we, again, run out of there like we've, well, seen a ghost. The super, who's not privy to the rise of the living dead, sees 2 6'3" cops thundering down the hallway at him and figures this is his cue to get moving too. Sadly for him, we overtake him and his stubby little legs and leave him to be dined up by the zombie. Survival of the fittest and all, right? We got down to the next flight before we figured out that even if it was a zombie, it was an old lady one and we could probably kick its ass. We went back into the apartment and called an ambulance for her. She apparently had a stroke alone in the apartment and sat there for a few days. The hand and vocalizations were really what was left of her brain responding to stimulus. Went by the hospital the next day before work, but she was too far gone. I'm not a cop, but I work with the state police running tows for them, and this 2012 Christmas call still gives me nightmares. We got our emergency call to a crash that was blocking traffic both ways. We ran over there with a flatbed assuming the worst. But when we got there we were met with a rather awful scene. Usually people are banged up and we wait for them to be pulled out and then tow the car. So this was a first for me. The pickup truck was indeed blocking traffic. It had been T-boned pulling out of the Walmart parking lot. The truck was turned around in the center of the road. Cops and medics just standing around. We approached the scene. Horn is still blaring on the truck. There is a man hunched over. His brain is spattered all over the interior of the truck. His head is mangled and now part of the steering wheel, hence the horn blaring. The gate of the truck had come down, throwing Christmas presents, perfectly wrapped with bows and cards, thrown all over the road. Between the brains and Christmas gifts, I quit that night. Not a cop, but I know a lot about the case and know some people who discovered it. In my city, at the Trave Lodge on the main commercial street, a few people who met on some dating site or Craigslist or something ended up ritually killing themselves inside one of the rooms. According to the police report, the 2 people who found it weren't the actual cops, but rather the next door occupants. They heard a commotion and looked out their door, only to find blood coming through the door, like it was the faking Shining. They walked in to investigate and found the mangled bodies of the two women who found each other and the barely living body of the guy who found them both. As he told it, they were supposed to let him kill them both for the glory of Satan or some shit like that. Then he would kill himself. The crime scene was so gruesome and traumatic that several police officers and paramedics and nurses who treated the guy were all later treated for post-traumatic stress. And the incident has led the way for a movement calling for having PTSD therapy for first responders. Not to mention, in another comment on this thread, an Air Force major, who, get this, was in charge of the local cadet corps, was found with a massive, multi-terabyte storage of child porn on his computers. I was in cadets for a few years a while back, Army, and the commanding officer of our air sister corps was caught with CP. This guy was a major, and he was in charge of 100 children on a weekly basis. I was told he later hung himself in order to escape prosecution. Funny story, I was on a school field trip and our bus driver wore a bomber jacket with Royal Canadian Air Cadet Corps crest on it. I sparked up a conversation with him, and as it turns out, it was Major Pedo's direct successor. One thing led to another, and we got on the conversation about the major pedophile and how the Corps reacted. Believe it or not, but as it turns out, taking over the Air Cadet Corps from someone like that isn't as hard as one would expect. Apparently. The cop who found it, coincidentally the mother of one of the air cadets in the Corps, called it the most disgusting thing she has seen in all her years of service. No wonder that Major Pedo decided to call it quits. Safe to say it, but my town of 200,000 people is quite the little fuck up. Mind you, I haven't even mentioned being the meth and crack and heroin per capita capital of Ontario. That's a whole nother story. Not as creepy or disturbing as a lot of the posts on here, but I'll share my stories. I live in a small town, so we don't get much excitement. I'm friends with the local sheriff, so I get all the gossip and even access to crime scenes. First story. There is an elderly couple that lives out in the middle of the woods. 3 men broke into their house in the middle of the night and tried to rob them. The couple wouldn't give them the combination to the safe, so the men dragged them into the basement. They were tied to a pole and beaten. The men then dumped gasoline on them and burned them alive. The smell was repulsive. Second, there was a house where a family was murdered about 20 years ago. The house went up for sale afterwards and was bought by an acquaintance of mine. I went over to his house for some sort of get together. I can't remember why I was there. I'm not friends with him. Turns out he still has the chalk outlines of the bodies in the basement. Third, I was good friends with the son of the old town sheriff. I would go over to his house and there was one room that was always locked. It was a very large room in the center of his house and he would be in there all the time. He didn't let me or his son in there ever. He died of cancer a few years ago, and we went into the room. Inside there was a large bar. There were fully dressed mannequins everywhere and positioned in ways that made it look like they were all interacting with each other. It was creepy. As a detective, my partner and I were called out late one night on a 2-year-old who drowned in a bathtub. There were 6 kids under 9 in the house. There were 0 adults. We separated the kids and talked to them individually. The first 2 I talked to didn't know much. Mom is gone. We never know when she'll be back. I don't have a dad. I was asleep. Basic stuff like that. I went to get my 3rd kid to interview, and my partner was still taking to his first one, a 5-year-old girl. And my partner is white as a ghost. 5-year-old is calm and matter of fact. The 5-year-old said the 2-year-old wouldn't stop crying. She tried to make him stop crying, but he always started crying again. So she ran a bath, put the toddler in it, and held his head under the water until he stopped fighting. Then she got a bowl of dry cereal because she was hungry. Throughout the time we were there, she continued to display no emotion. Talk about one of those days you just want to go home and hug your kids. In the end, 2 adults were charged with child neglect and the state took the kids. The juvenile prosecutor never charged the 5-year-old with a crime, which is a shame, because juvenile court is the best way to ensure that the suspect gets counseling or something. I'm not a police officer and this isn't about a house search, but I'm a security officer in a casino, and you wouldn't believe the random shit you see in one of these places. This is probably from over 6+ months ago. but we got a call for someone overdosing in one of the hotel rooms. A few of our EMTs were dispatched, and about 5 of us security officers were dispatched to the call in reference to suspects from the room fleeing the scene of a crime. So the EMTs get up to the room and a guy answers the door. He so happened to be the victim's boyfriend. He stated that his girlfriend was on the bed naked packed with ice, and he books it out of the room along with her best friend, her boyfriend, and 2 others. The EMTs enter the room, start working on the girl. Meanwhile myself and 4 of the other officers hop in the mobile units to find the fleeing subjects. This entire time, the fire dept and police dept were en route to the property. 4 of them decided to book it on foot over a levee and they were stopped. Myself and another guy cut through one of our parking lots and stopped the boyfriend. We finally get him cuffed and in the vehicle, and we drive him over to the police, who are already with the 4 other subjects. Turns out the boyfriend was a neo-Nazi who had a few teardrop tats and the SS emblem on his forearm along with the swastika and spider web tats, prison tats, all over his body. The police search the guy and don't find a thing, as we did also. They find a Bowie knife, a stiletto, and some other fixed blades that he had in his backpack along with 2 loaded handguns with about 150 rounds of ammo. Meanwhile they were searching the other 4 and her best friend so happened to have everyone's paraphernalia and drugs in her purse. They find the following: 2.58 balls, ½ ounce of crystal, 2 grams of heroin, about 3.5 ounces of weed, about 50 perks/arxes, a script of Xanax, and a bunch of needles. Meanwhile the boyfriend starts going into a frenzy and starts freaking out about how the brotherhood will take care of him while he's away in prison, etc etc. Needless to say they all get arrested and taken to the local police station. Back to the girl, who is odding into the room. The EMTs resuscitate the victim, but she had a very low pulse. So she leaves with the paramedics and go to the hospital. Needless to say she left with a pulse, but ended up becoming brain dead and taken off of life support. Back to the hotel room, after everyone was taken into custody and the girl was sent to the hospital where she later passed, we had to go into the room with some detectives. As soon as you walked into the presidential suite, you looked to the right where the bathroom was, and it was like something out of a movie. They had 5 chairs in the bathroom all in a circle, with incense still burning, belts, tourniquets, and needles everywhere. The bed was still wet from where the girl's body was laying packed in ice, and on each mirror in the room there was a swastikas with the letters AB all over, and white power in blood everywhere. We also ended up finding 5 copies of Mein Kampf in the room as well. Hands down one of the creepiest/strangest calls I've had while I've worked here. I have a detective friend who told me the story of a recent case. A man injected his female co-worker in the neck with a syringe full of ketamine while at gunpoint. They had been on their way to lunch in his car. She fought back and was able to escape before the drugs kicked in. He was captured without incident, and in the trunk of his car was a kill kit, that is duct tape, rope, hatchet, tarps, the works. Upon investigating his apartment, they discovered that he had gotten rid of all his possessions except for 1 suitcase and a notebook. This notebook was one long list names, the first in the list being the female co-worker. Here's the kicker. The victim didn't take any of this seriously, and, despite numerous attempts at changing her mind on the part of the police, she refused to press charges. Based on what little the guy had actually done, he was let go with a misdemeanor. My friend finished the story by stating, "I know this guy will kill someday." Not me, but good friend of mine responded to a home invasion call. Goes inside to find out the homeowner was a meticulous collector of World War I items. Had helmets for an entire company of German soldiers. Knew the history of all of them. Who they were, where they were from, how and when they died, etc etc. All the helmets are on fake head statues made of plaster. All the helmets that were from dead soldiers, the statues were crying. Apparently this is a thing for plaster statues. I've never seen this, and take it as embellishment from said friend. He goes downstairs to find the collector has 2 true to life statues in full combat gear from the British Army on display. What's really weird is the guy had gone so far as to collect the actual kit from the soldiers, and has all their items, minus personals, that would have been returned to family. But wait, there's more. He has reconstructed the faces and statues to exactly match the real life person. I guess he was able to track down the recruiting documents and pictures of these men and went to work. The fact that this guy had all this memorabilia and had clearly dedicated his life to it and had gone so far as to recreate soldiers really freaked my friend out. The level of obsession must have been amazing to see. He also told me once that one of the mannequins downstairs is in a kneeling shooting position directly facing the stairs and that it nearly ended up with some new holes in its uniform. Again, not sure if this part is real, but it's funny to imagine. The really funny part, the robber stolen bucks, a TV, 2 laptops and a toaster oven, and not the literal millions of dollars worth of gear. My time to shine. Creepiest or funniest? I don't know. I remember we did a search in a motorcycle clubhouse which was well known with criminal activity. We got anonymous information that they stacked guns in there. Those are not allowed in my country. I remember we blasted the door and started the search. About an half hour later none of us had find something. I started checking the roof plates. Those white ones that you can lift easily. All I see is darkness, so I asked my colleague for a flashlight. When I shined that light in there I got happy. I saw a black bag hidden up there. Guns was my first thought. I moved under that place and lifted the bag. It was heavy, so I shouted, "Got 'em guys." I putted the bag on the ground and around 8 colleagues had gathered around that bag. When I opened it, I was stunned what I found. A bag full of dildo, but not normal dildo. Some were 60 centimeters long at least and huge. Some looked used. We all bursted out laughing and left the place later. Of course I putted the bag on the ground to be visible for the motorcycle guys, as I guess some member hid it there. TLDR, found a bag full of used huge dildo during a search in a motorcycle club. Not a cop, but I competed in TPSA and Skills USA law enforcement competitions. Got to practice building clearing with some local officers and a SWAT team. They'd set up scenarios, and we'd clear the building with simulation guns or sometimes have a set up domestic disturbance call. We had a building clearing drill, and as I'm moving down this long hallway, with no lights, and only my flashlight giving me any vision at all, I hear heavy, but hesitant footsteps heading towards me directly in front of me. This girl, pretty cute by the way, is standing in front of me with her hands up, and she's breathing really hard and acting hysterical. Keep in mind I understand this is just a scenario, but in the heat of the moment it feels very real. She's talking really fast and acting panicked, saying some guys in the back with a gun. I'm looking past her towards where she's talking about, and then she sprints towards me with the rubber knives we have. Needless to say I nearly pissed myself, and she stabbed me in the chest. To everyone's amusement, that's just one of many things we did. Super late, but this is a story told to me by a guy I apprenticed for. He was a RNJ cop in the 80s and went to a 90-year-old woman's house with his partner on a welfare check. No response to knocking on the door, so they circled the property. My apprentice master looked through a back window and saw the little old lady. The glass was rippled and not very clear, but it looked like she was floating. He knocks on that window and the lady doesn't move. Thinks she may have hung herself. They try the nearest door and it opens. They hit the room's lights and see the little old lady in the kitchen, dead, her lower jaw impaled beneath the chin on a very sharp iron Spanish-style cabinet handle. She must have been standing on the counter reaching for something, then slipped. Because the handle was pointed like an arrowhead, they couldn't lift her off the spike. It was the 80s and in Jersey City, so they A, didn't have time to wait for somebody to bring cutters for the iron, and B, had tough stomachs / no consciences. After a few minutes of trying to jiggle her jaw off, my apprentice master says "fuck it" and pulls out a combat knife and saws the old lady's jaw off her face at the hinges, then split the remaining jaw in half and took it off that way. He laughed telling this story. Super late to the party here, not a cop, but used to be on eviction and reclamation team, so we saw some shit. Creepiest situation by far was this cookie cutter McMansion style house. Pool in the back, big yard, suburbia. From the outside it looks like no one has been living there for a while. Totally overgrown hedges, ivy creeping up the siding, dirt all over the entrances. Once we get in it's completely faking haunting. There's no power, so we are just working from the sunlight through the windows, and it appears as if the last tenants just skipped out of town. There were trash bags full of belongings, clothes, books, trinkets, you name it. The kids' beds had been flipped in their room and there was furniture just strewn about, clothes half packed into garbage bags. In the kitchen, right in front of the island, was a massive white garbage bag filled with prescription pill bottles for eye cancer treatment for a woman. We assumed the mother. Guys, this bag was filled. I'm talking 300 to 400 yellow child-proof pill bottles with every shape and size pill, plenty of them full of pills. Right next to the bag, a big ol' puddle of dried blood that had obviously been there for months and months. Weird shit. Anyway, I never figured out what happened. I've mostly blocked that memory out until now. Tiny brown roaches crawling in and out of the mouth of a 8-month-old baby. Update. A lot of people asking what happened. I was dispatched for a child neglect call. The neighbor had called the police because the parents left earlier that day and she heard a baby crying intermittently throughout the day. I was the first to respond to the call with another officer from a zone over. We heard the baby crying. We kicked down the door, and I was absolutely disgusted. There were dirty diapers piled in a corner, dishes strewn all over the kitchen, food left all over. The place smelled absolutely horrible. The baby was in the crib crying, and these tiny German roaches had infested the entire house. As he cried, these roaches were crawling all over him, in his mouth. I have seen a guy's head smashed like a watermelon and the sight of everything made me gag. The other officer removed the child from the crib and went outside. CPS came and took the baby a few minutes later. We later testified in court and the parents have been locked up, in case anyone was curious. Don't know what happened to the baby, but I'm sure anywhere is a better home at this point. Paramedic here, responded to a call for a cardiac arrest, no sheet. Turns out the guy hadn't paid rent in 3 months. Landlord got pissed and sent a locksmith round to change the locks. We walked up the stairs to the apartment to be greeted by a locksmith vomiting on the stairs and flies, big fuck off dumb death flies bouncing off our faces. It was like a lower budget scene from The Mummy. Enter the apartment and it's really gloomy. Curtains closed, dimly lit, TVs on cycling through all the settings itself. Color contrast brightness. Repeat. Fuck, I hate this part. Where is he then? Scan the room. Dried old blood on the carpet amongst beer cans and trash. Chair, sofa, lamp, TV. Where the fuck is he? Chair, sofa, lamp. Oh wait. The lamp was the dude. No head, sitting in the corner of the room. He was naked, had turned black, was a white dude, almost skeletal. His neck muscles had rotted, and his head had fallen down his back. His pelvis had 2 large holes either side and they were crawling with maggots and the source of our welcoming party of death flies. We then had to wait for 20 minutes before the police showed up, and had fun playing spot the dead guy with a rookie cop. Also, not a room search story, but my first bad job as a pro B. Woman suicide by train. She had laid down with her head neatly over the track. Found her head about 100 foot away, neatly still inside her jacket hood. Freaked me the fuck out for a bit. Not a cop, but been in a drug den a few years ago by accident. I was accompanying a friend in doing his tasks not knowing a drug deal was going to happen. He doesn't have a car, so he asked if I can run for about 30 minutes to deliver something, and shit got scary AF. We entered the drug den with different people from the lowest of the low to some rich guys wearing a barring, which usually is a formal attire in my country that lawyers and politicians would usually wear. The place is very dark with only one light source, a car battery modded to produce light tied to some wires and sheet. As we passed the people doing hits of meth, I saw a room with doors open where 3 people are having sex. Note that this isn't hot at any point at all. Imagine 3 uglies doing it high. So as we walk to the end of the hall, a room where my friend delivered the drugs is filled with at least 6 people currently having a drug session. Then, my friend decided to stay a few minutes to take a few hits. Then they asked me if I want to do it. I said no. Then all 7 of them are saying do it. Come on, it's not that bad. I was scared AF, not knowing what would happen if I decline another time. I was thinking that I could literally die here if I piss these people off. I took a hit, but did not intake the smoke. Note that here in my country, meth is smoked on top of foil using their homemade paraphernalia. So again, I did not intake the smoke, I just blew it as soon as smoke touches my mouth, you know, like how beginners started out smoking. We stayed for another 20 to 30 minutes, and it was hell. 2 kids at the age of 3 to 6 started entering going near their mom and dad like this is a normal thing. I'm scared these kids will grow up knowing meth is a normal thing people do. As time went on, they are talking about how a drug raid happened, and one of their friends got gunned down. At this point, I'm worried anytime cops will come in and raid the fuck out of the den, and I go down as a drug user as well. In the end, I ask my friend if we can get the F out as soon as possible, since it's getting really late. I was mad at my friend and drove off and dropped him at the nearest gasoline station. We said our goodbyes, and after I get home, I blocked all communications with him and have never seen him ever since. I reported to the police anonymously, but have no idea what happened next. TLDR, friend asked me to help deliver his goods. Turned out it was a drug den with kids running around. Got forced into doing drugs due to being scared af. Got out and left my friend to a nearby gas station and never seen him ever since. Reported to the police anonymously. I cheat on cops a lot on, well, the entire internet, but there are in fact 1 or 2 decent ones. One being a guy I went to school with who has always been really respectful and fair with me. His first day was basically nightmare material. Domestic call, they can't get in and are looking for the super to get keys to the apartment. They hear screaming to the effect of no please, don't. First day out he has to draw his weapon. Most cops in this town never have to do that their entire career. They bust the door and find the man straddling his wife, stabbing her in the chest. When they order him to stop, he instead grabs another knife within reach and slits his own throat ear to ear. In his words, deep red blood, arterial blood, sprayed a good few feet, and it ended up all over the room. She died after a few days. I think he lived. She was stabbed something like 14 times. It was a long time ago, so I can't remember if she was doer or lived, and I know he lived for at least a while. Not sure if he survived to stand trial, but I think he did. Hell of a first day. My best friend was an officer for about 5 years, and this was his worst/best story. He received a call from dispatch for a welfare check, and when he got to the home, of course there was no response. He mentioned a pungent smell of death as he stepped foot in the door, knowing damn well this wasn't going to be good. After regrouping himself from the smell, he began to walk down this long hallway where he assumed the smell was coming from. He was halfway down the hall when he noticed blood everywhere in the next room. We are talking floor to ceiling. As he turned the corner into that room, he saw a little ankle biter laying there chewing on something and didn't really think much of it. He then panned the room for a second before he noticed a guy laying in a recliner, holding onto a shotgun, pointed at his mouth. This man had literally blown his brains out, had half of a head, and his dog was chewing on a piece of his skull/face. The smell was so awful due to the fact that this guy was sitting in his house with no account in the summer heat for 3 days. Talk about a fun start to your day. Not a cop, but my roommate is a first responder. A few years back, the local Indian reservation was having a bit of a crack cocaine problem. Everyone knew who the big drug dealer was, but the RCMP's hands were tied due to jurisdiction issues with the tribal police. Now, the tribal police had their own issues with corruption, etc. Case in point, a convicted pedophile acting as a tribal police officer. Well, it seems that no one in law enforcement wanted to try and take this dealer down, so some of the tribal members decided to pursue justice their own way. Anyhow, my roommate is working the night in question and is dispatched to this dealer's house on the reservation. When he and his partner arrive, the house is surrounded by cops, guns drawn, and my roommate has to wait to enter until the property has been cleared. Finally, they get word that there are 2 casualties inside, probably both dead, but need to be checked out by paramedics before they can call the coroner's office. So my roommate grabs his bag and walks in. There, in a darkened living room lit only by the TV which is still on, he sees the dealer sitting in his easy chair, feet up and remote in hand. His entire face is gone. He had taken multiple gunshots to the face and head. He knew it was futile, but he checks for a pulse and of course there is none. The cops then beckon him into another room, where the dealer's underage girlfriend lay on the floor. She had been shot so many times in the torso that the only thing keeping her body together was a spinal column. My roommate didn't have to check to know she was very dead and just told the cops to go ahead and call in the coroner. Now he's seen lots of faked up shit in his line of work, but he said the thing he found the most creepy about the whole situation was a dude sitting there watching TV with his face blown off, laugh tracks going off in the background from whatever show he had it on. He said it was something out of a horror movie. Anyhow, I don't think they ever arrested anyone for the murders, but I'm pretty sure they all knew who was involved in ridding the res of their drug lord. My brother was a police officer for a while. One night he came over and had dinner with us. He was married with kids. He was really quiet, and I asked him if he was okay. Here's what I remember him saying. First, he swallowed the food in his mouth, took a quick drink and just stared at his plate for a bit. A guy gets ripping drunk at a bar, easily over the limit, almost double, jumps on his motorcycle and screams through town at about 80 miles per hour. He runs a red light and T-bones a pickup truck, flies over the bed of the truck and skids out about 55 feet later. No broken bones, but lots of road rash. He's in the hospital a couple of days, then off to jail. Another motorcycle accident. Older couple on a Goldwing. All safety gear, obeying the law, the whole nine. Toyota Tacoma hits them at about 35 miles per hour. He breaks his neck on the curb, dead on the spot. She gets pinned under the bike, legs broken and knee is wasted. Probably have to amputate. I was on both calls, about 2 hours apart. Sometimes you just gotta wonder. And then he went back to eating dinner. When I asked my dad to tell me some of the worst things he'd ever experienced in the police force, I never actually expected to hear the gnarliest story I had ever heard. He was often the first officer on the scene after a death was reported. Many of these cases were old people who had heart attacks or suffered similar, relatively bland fates by comparison. But every now and then he'd get called out to help deal with people who had fallen asleep in the bath and remained submerged for days, sometimes weeks. He told us about the old man who had one of those heating element that kept your bath warm. He slow cooked for 2 weeks before his daughter found him in what was essentially a human crock pot without the lid. That was bad. The other story is worse. He was called out with his colleague to help deal with an old man who had come home from the pub, had a stroke and died. He had laid down in front of their electric fireplace before the event. Here's where it gets super faked. His wife, who by this point was very far gone with Alzheimer's disease, had brought him a huge collection of toast, crumpets, beans on toast etc and numerous cups of tea, and had laid them around her husband over the course of 2 weeks. My dad said that she had zero comprehension of anything they had said to her. She either referred to the old man as her boyfriend, the strange guest or the gas man. They had been married for 40 years. When my old man and his colleagues proceeded to remove the corpse, he said it took them ages, as the meat was so tender that it slipped off the bone of whatever part of the body they lifted off the ground. The smell was apparently unfathomable, and no human should ever look the way that old man did. I never knew half of the shit my dad experienced in the police, but I guess it sort of explains his bitterness and the fact that he can be an RC piece. My girlfriend still wants to study forensic science, which is cool as fuck, but I could never do it after hearing many of his tales. Super faking gnarly. I think I'm late, but here goes nothing. My mum was in the PSNI, and she told once about a call she responded to on a country road somewhere in Ireland. I don't know about elsewhere. People drive on country roads like faking madmen, so inevitably when a woman was jogging or running, or whatever in the wee hours of the morning, one such madman hit her. The thing is, he hit her in such a way that she went up, so most of what was left of her was strung from the trees and branches beside the road. Another case, less creepy but still a little bit, I think. Woman walking her dog along a main road near where I used to live, gets hit because 2 guys are racing down the road. The guy who hits her stops and is visibly distraught by his guilt when the police arrive, while the other guy just speeds off. She recalled how later, the other driver came past the other way, and he craned his neck to look at the end result, like he wasn't equally responsible for another person's death. The part that got her is that the dog survived and ran away, naturally freaking out at this turn of events. They had to go and tell her husband she was dead, but that they'd found the dog. I don't know how you can even deal with that kind of news. M's here. Work with PD quite often, so I see the same faked up things with them. Lots of dead bodies in all forms obviously. However, the one thing that comes to mind was the dead man with a literal bucket of dildy beside him. Patient had died in the night and we were called to confirm death. He was in a poorly lit basement on a bed with junk strewn about the whole room. Everyone was so focused on the body that no one noticed the bucket. I had taken a step back to survey the room, and I caught first sight of it. Now I've got a dead man next to me, and a decent number of PD, M's, fire rescue, and unknowns in the same room. I instantly start suppressing my laughter because of the unknowns, who are possibly family. I'm getting to the point where I'm coughing to cover up my laughs, so I finally elbow a medic next to me and point at the bucket. I figure if I'm going down, I'm taking someone with me. The other medic starts to laugh, and about the same time PD reaches down with gloved hands and picks up a massive rubberized dildo and starts laughing while taking a picture of it. Everyone in the basement starts to laugh, and that's when I realized all the unknowns were just fire rescue dressed in civilian clothes. Not a cop, but relevant. I used to work at a music store when I was in high school. One day, my boss was telling me about how a young guy used to live in one of the apartments above the music store and worked right across the street at a bike shop. This was a few years before my tenure at the music store. My boss told me about how the owner of the bike shop had been getting suspicious because bike parts started to go missing from the shop. Eventually he discovered that the young employee was coming back to the bike shop after hours and stealing parts, selling them, and pocketing the money. The police ended up getting involved and went and investigated the young guy's apartment, which was above the music store. About to wrap up the investigation, they asked the bike shop owner if anything else besides parts had gone missing. He replied, "Come to think of it, there was a mannequin in the window that just disappeared one day and I haven't been able to find it." The cop responded, "Oh, we found that. You probably don't want it back." Apparently when the police had searched the young guy's apartment, they found the mannequin in his bed with a rubber vagina glued to it. My uncle, who used to be a cop, my father did as well, told me a story about a man that had died in a motel room. The man had a heart attack while on the toilet, similar to Elvis, and his body had been there for some time, long enough for the neighbors to complain to the front desk that an odor was coming from the motel room next door. There are a couple of motels that do extended stays for people out of town that come here for work. Well, long story short, after the coroner had came and they were taking the body away, they went to lift the body off of the toilet, and during the process their fingers broke through the skin and the weight of his lower body separated the bottom half from the top. He said that he can still remember the smell. There was another story of motorcycle accident that took place and the man didn't have a helmet on, so you can imagine what was all over the road. He was also a warden to a prison, and he said he has seen it all there. Rape, murder, transvestites, gangs, the whole works. My dad on the other hand doesn't tell a lot of stories. Only story I got out of him was coming across a body in an alleyway in the wintertime, which the cause of death was again a heart attack. So, I got a couple of these from my father-in-law, who is retired PD, 30 years on the job, and was active military before that. The first one that stuck out was a 21-year-old Caucasian female that had been dead in a bathtub, no water, for the better part of a week. She'd gone to the bathroom and began seizing as she pulled her undies up, fell over and hit her head, landing in the tub. The coroner initially thought they were dealing with the body of an older, age 50 plus, African American female due to the state of her body. Texas weather can do some serious things to a corpse. It wasn't until they finished combing through some of her belongings that they were able to identify her and properly identify her race. Another that stood out was the suicide of a troubled young man. He had apparently just been dumped by his girlfriend and had been incessantly sending her messages until they stopped one day. I guess after some time, she got worried, so she called for a wellness check, and when my L&Ms arrived, he had hung himself, but he'd been there so long that his neck was stretched about 8 to 10 inches. He also said the faces of hangers are pretty gruesome if they've been there for a while. Anything involving soldiers/veterans gets retry intense/can be borderline creepy, especially if there is severe PTSD involved, to the point of flashbacks and hallucinations. Drunk chicks were the worst/best part of the job. He once had a woman intentionally hike her skirt up while going commando when he pulled her over, so he sent his rookie to go deal with her and her giant bush. That weirded him out, and his rookie hated him for it. Man, so many stories, but no more that really apply to this, I guess. A police captain I know always tells the story of a search warrant on a father and son. Upon arriving at the house, every officer was immediately struck by a vile smell. Detectives and officers on scene claimed they knew the smell, and it was similar to a dead body. After multiple minutes of attempting to make contact with anyone inside, the front door was broken down. The officers entered and began to search the house. Upon entering a back room of the house, the son was discovered. He was in a room with over 50 plus buckets filled with human feces, and he was in the process of eating the feces from one of these buckets. The son was completely naked, entire body covered in feces. The son looked like a skeleton. He was arrested and brought out of the room, where officers met the other officers who encountered the same situation in the father's room. The father and son were sat on the floor as the officers attempted to take all this in. Then all of a sudden the son started to yell, "Dad, I have to sheet." The dad responded, "Just sheet on floor, sheet all over them, son." The son then jumped up and started sheeting, while bucking like a bronco. Sheet was flying everywhere and getting all over the officers who attempted to subdue the son. The father was yelling with excitement and attempted to lick his son's feces from the floor. The officers finally stopped the two men and brought them outside into their squad cars. Over 100 plus buckets were found throughout the house filled with human feces. They are known as the suburban sheeters. Not a cop, but worked for my friend's dad in high school back in 2001. He bought rickety old homes and turned them into rentals after some renovation. Me and buddies were assigned to rip the guts out of a house an elderly woman had died in. We never saw her, thank goodness, but from what I remember she died in the middle of summer and wasn't found until the neighbors complained about a smell. We got into the house about a month after she died, and boy did it still stink. Someone had done the courtesy of removing the chair/carpet from the room she died in, so we were a little confused about where the smell was coming from. But odd smells in the houses we worked in weren't that unusually. We were frequently in ones hoarders or elderly passed away in. There is always a smell, but this house had a smell I still remember. Like ammonia, poo, garbage, and rotten meat-ish like smell. Really hard to describe, but it was just unbearable. We opened all the windows, but it didn't help. Per the usual, we started poking around the house to see what got left behind. The house had most the furniture still there, dresses and stuff all still there. I would imagine her family just grabbed the essential precious stuff and called it a day due to the smell. We checked the attic, found an old box of Playboys from the 80s, some fireworks, didn't work. Nothing all that interesting. We make our way to the basement, and as soon as we open the door, wham, the source of the smell. From the top of the stairs we can hit the light and see the floor is damp, but it isn't water. My buddy went down to check it out and came running back up gagging and heaving. 20 to 30 dead cats just rotting away, and a good number of clean cat skeletons in a damp basement. Old lady had been keeping cats in the basement like prisoners. There looked to be years worth of cat crap on the floor. I'm guessing that house smelled long before she died. We didn't end up gutting that, had to call in some professionals. Clearing a house where you're expecting a body is the scariest because you don't know how you'll find them, what state they'll be in or exactly where they are, and you're 100% sure they're a zombie that's about to eat your face off. The first one I saw was a suicide by a well-to-do chap in his backyard swimming pool. After seeing him in the pool from afar, it took about 5 minutes for me to work up the guts to get a closer look. I made myself really tall so I wouldn't get too close and accidentally fall in when the body released gas sending up bubbles. Naturally I squealed, because I thought he was still alive. He wasn't. I got laughed at. Another time I was going through a burglar's backpack after we'd caught him running from the jewelry store he and a mate had burgled. They staked out the place for about 6 hours in a fire escape after it had closed. As I was searching his bags there was a smell like dirty wet feet, which I didn't think much of because a lot of crooks have a particular smell about them. There was a heavy package wrapped inside 2 gardening gloves that I opened and looked inside. Turns out the burglar was busting for a poo and didn't want to leave his DNA behind in the fire stairs, so he sheet in a sock and wrapped it up in gloves. Once got a call to a lady screaming. Could be heard by multiple houses on a street. Turn up at the street and there's only one house with lights on. Head towards it and the door opens and our steps a men with a beanbag, stark naked. I'm a little shocked. The guy sees run and screams running back into the house. The blinds for the front room have been pulled, but not very well. We peek through and see the guy sit back down, still naked next to his naked friend. On the TV, Gayborn. The guy who came outside then stares at the window, clearly aware we are watching, and starts pleasuring his male friend with his face, whilst his eyes are fixated on the window. They were clearly enjoying this party. There's a little blood and some bondage things around. Eventually they let us in. Their S&M was a little too hardcore, but I think they enjoyed the 5 men in uniform in their living room, still naked. Side note, their cat was called Scrodina. That was pretty cool. Late to the party but not a cop. Back at uni I was taking psychopharmacology and I had an interview with the head of the local drug enforcement agency at a town of 40k that was often used to store and process drugs en route to 3 major metropolitan areas within 90 miles. I couldn't help but ask this question. The town was pretty dilapidated, so a lot of the gangs would hole up in abandoned houses for a month or to then move on to a new one. So when they found these places, no electricity, running water, wasn't unheard of to find a dead body or 2. They were usually disgusting to say the least. The one that stood out in the officer's mind, for whatever reason they, gang members, had decided to stay at this place a lot longer than usual. 2 years they found out later. Immediately a nasty smell, sewage/rot, but the place was actually fairly well kept, so they were confused, but just assume a burst pipe. Searching the place they found a storage room in back with a portable lantern hanging on the wall, a lazy boy chair and some adult magazines. After shedding some light they figured out there was a hole cut in the chair and another one in the floor below, straight opening into the basement. When they found and opened the door to the basement, he said almost every officer in the house threw up. TLDR 2 years of rotting poo in a basement. Was at my friend's house once when I was like 14. I was sleeping over my buddy's house and his dad told us that my friend's older sister, 20-ish years old, would be coming home at around 3 AM. We are young, so we were playing Battlefield Bad Company 2 all night when the door opens, but not the garage door the sister usually comes in. We didn't even check, since we automatically assumed it was her, and when the dad came downstairs and said he heard the door open but his daughter, my friend's sister, wasn't in her room, he asked if we had gone outside. We said no, and then shit got real very fast. Like it just hits you what had just happened. Someone was in the house. It's a decently sized 3-story house. He told us to get behind the couch, call 911, while he went to go the gun drawer in some cabinet in his pantry. His dad grabbed a shotgun and gave me and his son a pistol. I'm 14 at the time. I've shot before, as my dad had just gotten certified and wanted me to go with him to a range, and my friend was sort of a redneck, so he'd been around guns his whole life. When we got the guns, he told us to just sprint to the neighbor's house. Looking back, it was pretty fucking cool, but also incredibly scary. The story ends by my friend's dad basically announcing through the house intercom that he has a gun, which spooked the thief or robber or whatever, and the cops came and arrested him, and I was cool at school for the next week. Friend of a cop. On a mobile, so formatting. Edit. This is not a house searcher, but sort of car search and not creepy. Just a funny and unbelievable cop story that I wanted to share. Had a gentleman come into his station to the front desk to report a crime. The said gentleman told the desk sergeant that a man had shortchanged him on his massive weed order and had robbed him of over £200 because of this. I should point out the guy had obviously been smoking it by this point as we was apparently stinking of weed. Desk sergeant calls my friend Imp from the back for a second opinion on how to approach the robbery. My friend instantly smells the weed and asks the gentleman if he still had the weed and how much he had. The gentleman replied with, "Yeah man, still got it. He only gave me half the amount I paid for, so I came here." My friend asks where the weed was, only to be told in the boot of his car in the police station car park. My friend asks the gentleman to take him to the car so he could see the weed and judge what offense the robber would be getting pulled up for later on. Said gentleman of course leads my friend out to the car, opening his boot to reveal over £400 of weed, followed by major confusion as my friend slaps the cuffs on him. I somehow pulled a regional manager position with this moving company, and I was responsible for the region by the college town. The first job I ever got was this girl whose out of town mother had paid for the moving service, so the only people present for the load up were myself and my buddy, both of us being about 20 years old, and this girl who was being moved. The girl was early 20s, as was her friend whose parents' house she was moving into. I'm not a clean person, I'm pretty lazy, but oh my god, should the mother have paid someone to clean up her spot. She was practically one step away from being a hoarder. There was a barely carved out pathway leading from the front door to her bedroom, but this was a studio. Whatever you can think occupied the one room that this girl had, it was probably there. Dishes with weeks old food that wasn't on dishes, but looked like it should have been thrown away months prior, that was just part of it. My buddy and I pack up all of her shit while she tends to her bedroom items, load up the U-Haul truck, drive to her friend's parents' house which is up in the hills on really shitty, narrow and windy roads. The driveway left virtually no space between the decline and the garage, which is where we were offloading all of the stuff. For the moving truck's ramp to extend properly, I had to position the truck with a slight tilt towards the tail end. Well, the boxes that she had her stuff in weren't sealed by any means. Most of them were not even interfolded, pseudo-sealed on the top. The dildo collection that poured out of the box was almost more impressive than the condition of her previous apartment. Some people are alcohol connoisseurs, so they will spend their days distinguishing minute, don't hate me, differences between any given product. This girl must have been a dildo connoisseur, the poor lass, slaving over her trade/passion with not a minute to clean her apartment. Her friend's parents were pretty faking surprised, and my buddy and I just kinda looked at each other and smiled as she was running over to pick the stuff up. I mean, what's the proper etiquette in a situation like that? Do we help her? Do we move other boxes to kinda take away focus? Or is that one of those things where you should make a really shitty joke? Looks like you could use a friend, hand. Everyone has things that they are ashamed of. It doesn't surprise me when I find something peculiar in someone's place. What surprises me is how they react when people find out.